My name is Emma. I'm 33 years old, and the day my father's will was read, my world collapsed in the most unexpected way. I sat in that oak-paneled office, hands clenched, waiting to hear his last words. For years, I had cared for him through illness, managed his medications, even put my own career on hold to be by his side. And yet, when the lawyer cleared his throat and began, the words cut me open. All assets, including the family estate and the company shares, are to be left to Daniel. My brother. The room spun. Daniel beamed. Our relatives clapped his back, and I sat frozen. And then the lawyer placed a small, rusted lockbox in front of me. To Emma, your father leaves this. Just a box. No instructions, no explanation. My brother smirked, whispering to an aunt. She gets junk, I get the empire. In that moment, I asked myself the questions you're probably asking right now. Why would a father strip his daughter of everything and leave her only a box? Was it a final insult? Or a hidden message? I didn't know it then, but that little lockbox was about to change everything. My family's lies, the legacy my father truly intended, and my own place in a world that had always dismissed me. Everything was about to unravel. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, stay with me. And don't forget, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the twists that are coming. When I was a child, my family's house felt like a stage, and we were all playing roles we never auditioned for. My brother Daniel was the golden boy, loud, charming, careless, and endlessly forgiven. I was the quiet one in the corner, clutching books while setting the table, the daughter who held things together when no one else bothered. My father, Charles, was a man who measured worth by legacy. He believed the family company was his masterpiece, the crown jewel he would pass on like a torch. For Daniel, the flame was already waiting. For me, the daughter who covered late payments, who drove father to his dialysis appointments, who gave up promotions to be home when he needed help. It was as if my devotion was invisible under the glare of Daniel's charm. I remember one Thanksgiving. Daniel stumbled in late, reeking of whiskey, knocking over the cranberry sauce. Father laughed, clapped him on the back, called him spirited. Later that night, when I asked if I could take a short trip with friends, Father's voice was cold. Your duty is here, Emma. Don't forget who you are. So I stayed. For years, I stayed. While Daniel traveled, failed at business after business, borrowed money he never repaid, I remained the constant presence. I paid bills, handled paperwork, signed checks on Father's behalf when his hands shook too much to hold a pen. And maybe, deep down, I believed that loyalty was its own reward, that when the curtain fell and the will was read, my role would finally be acknowledged. But as you already know, it wasn't. All I received was a rusted lockbox, and yet sometimes the smallest prop can change the entire play. My family was always an ensemble cast, though the script never gave me more than a supporting role. My father, Charles, played the patriarch with a voice like thunder when it suited him, and silence sharp enough to wound when it didn't. He could terrify a boardroom with a glance, but at home, his power came from the way he chose who mattered and who didn't. Daniel, my younger brother by 3 years, was the star. Every spotlight turned toward him, even when he didn't deserve it, especially when he didn't. Failed ventures, broken promises, debts disguised as opportunities. Somehow, he was always forgiven, always given another scene to shine in. The chorus of our family, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, applauded his every stumble as if it were part of a grand performance. They called him visionary, leader, the future. I was reliable Emma, the one who made the coffee, the one who stayed late after the meetings, the one who smoothed the stage curtain so the show could go on. And then there was Aunt Margaret, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, who never missed a chance to remind me that women in this family were caretakers, not leaders. She sat beside Daniel at every gathering, whispering in father's ear, reinforcing the myth that only sons could carry the legacy forward. Even the house itself felt like a stage set. Daniel's trophies displayed in the foyer like golden props, while the certificates I earned quietly collected dust in a drawer. So when the will was read and Daniel received the empire while I received a box, it wasn't shocking. It was scripted. But what no one expected, what no one rehearsed for, was that I would finally step out of the wings. Because sometimes the forgotten character is the one who rewrites the ending. That night, long after the will had been read and the applause for Daniel had faded, I sat alone in my apartment with the lockbox resting on the table before me. It was small, rusted at the edges, the kind of thing you might find at a flea market and pass over without a second glance. But my name was etched faintly on the lid, scratched by my father's hand. For hours, I just stared at it. Was this his final insult? His way of reducing me to nothing more than a custodian of scraps? Or was it something else? Finally, with trembling hands, I pried the box open. Inside, wrapped in yellowing paper, was a single brass key and a folded document. At first glance, the document looked like another contract, the kind I'd sorted for my father 100 times over the years. But this one was different. It was a draft, unsigned, undated. But the language was unmistakable. It detailed a pending deal between my father's company and a major investor, but with a startling clause tucked neatly inside. In the event of financial misconduct by the heir, all rights of ownership would revert to the secondary beneficiary named in the private addendum. My eyes froze on those words, a secondary beneficiary. There was no name on the draft itself, but attached with a paperclip was a smaller note, handwritten by my father. Emma, if you're holding this, the truth is now yours. Trust the key. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs. The key gleamed faintly under the kitchen light, ordinary yet heavy with implication. What did it unlock? A safe? An office drawer? Another secret hidden in the labyrinth of my father's empire? For years, I had believed my role in the family was fixed, that the script was already written. But this clause, this key, whispered otherwise. It suggested that maybe my father hadn't trusted Daniel as much as everyone thought, that maybe, despite the theater of favoritism, he had left me the one thing that truly mattered, a way to claim my place. And in that moment, staring at the key resting cold in my palm, I realized the play was far from over. For a long time, I just sat there with the brass key pressed into my palm, the metal biting into my skin as if to remind me it was real. I turned it over and over, searching for clues, as if the answers might be engraved in its grooves. What was I supposed to do with this? Why leave me nothing in public, but everything hidden in private? My first instinct was doubt. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe father had scribbled that note in a moment of weakness, some unfinished thought that never should have reached me. Daniel had the estate, the company, the applause. What chance did I have against that? And yet, the words on the contract draft wouldn't leave me alone. Secondary beneficiary named in the private addendum. That wasn't an accident. My father was meticulous, every clause a deliberate stroke of his pen. He had buried this detail the way some playwrights hide the real meaning in a single line of dialogue. I thought about the way he looked at Daniel in those final months, not with pride, but with exhaustion. I remembered the whispers of missing funds, the sharp phone calls behind closed doors. Could it be that father knew Daniel would betray the company? And this clause was his insurance policy? Still, fear gnawed at me. What if Daniel found out about the key before I discovered what it unlocked? What if the family turned on me even harder, painting me as desperate, delusional? I set the box back on the table, but I couldn't walk away. My life had been a stage where I was cast as invisible. This key was the first prop handed to me directly, the first sign that maybe my role wasn't finished after all. And though I didn't yet know where it would lead, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The very next weekend, Daniel threw a celebration dinner at the estate. His estate now, at least on paper. I went, maybe out of habit, maybe out of some desperate need to be seen. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew my place. Hadn't changed. Relatives circled Daniel like moths to a flame, praising his leadership, congratulating him on stepping into father's shoes. They didn't mention the trail of failed businesses, the debts quietly covered by family funds, the scandals brushed aside. To them, he was still the golden son. And me? I was the afterthought. An aunt leaned close, her voice dripping with pity. "At least your father thought of you, dear. That little box must have sentimental value." Daniel smirked across the room, raising his glass. "Emma's treasure chest," he called it, and laughter rippled through the crowd. I forced a smile, but inside I was burning. That box wasn't a joke. It was the only honest gift Father had ever left me. They saw rust and scraps. I saw a key that might unlock the truth. Later that night, as I helped clear plates, because of course no one else bothered, Daniel brushed past me and whispered, "Don't embarrass yourself trying to play a role you were never written for." The words cut deeper than he knew. For years, I had accepted being cast aside, waiting for applause that never came. But this time, something inside me resisted. Because while they laughed at my lockbox, I knew a secret none of them suspected. And secrets once revealed have a way of rewriting the entire play. The night after Daniel's dinner, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind. "Don't embarrass yourself trying to play a role you were never written for." I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the key cold against my palm. Finally, near dawn, I made a decision. I had to know what it unlocked. The next day, I drove to Father's office downtown. The building was quiet, half empty since his illness had kept him away. I still had my old access card from when I helped with paperwork during his treatments. My hand shook as I scanned it, but the light blinked green. Inside, the air smelled of dust and leather, like time had stopped the day he last walked out. The walls were lined with books, framed photos of Daniel cutting ribbons, shaking hands, playing the heir apparent. My photos were absent, as always. I moved straight to his mahogany desk. The drawers opened easily, pens, files, invoices. But then at the bottom, I found a compartment with a small brass lock. My breath caught. I slipped the key inside. It turned with a soft final click. Inside was a thick folder stamped "Confidential." I pulled it out, my pulse racing. The folder contained financial reports, pages and pages of discrepancies, missing funds, unexplained transfers. And attached at the top, in my father's precise handwriting, was a note. "If Daniel ever sits in this chair, Emma must have the power to stop him. This is my safeguard." I sank into his chair, the words burning into me. My father hadn't trusted Daniel at all. The empire that everyone thought was secure in my brother's hands was already rotting from the inside. And my father had known. He'd left me the key not just to a drawer, but to the truth. For the first time, I understood. The lockbox wasn't a consolation prize. It was a weapon. And now, in my hands, it was loaded. I left Father's office with the folder clutched so tightly under my arm that the edges cut into my skin. It felt like carrying contraband, a truth too dangerous to show, yet too powerful to let go. Daniel was out there celebrating his victory, basking in the role of heir, and he had no idea the ground beneath him was already cracking. That night in my apartment, I spread the documents across the dining table. Page after page revealed a story of neglect and greed. loans taken in Daniel's name, expenses disguised as consulting fees, transfers into accounts that didn't belong to the company. It wasn't just carelessness, it was theft. And my father had known. For years, I had been the quiet daughter, the caretaker, the stagehand behind the curtain. But now I was holding the script that could bring the whole performance crashing down. Still, I couldn't rush. If Daniel or Aunt Margaret suspected what I had, they'd twist it, bury it, or worse. So I began quietly documenting everything, making copies, scanning files, cross-referencing dates. I visited the county clerk's office, pretending to handle routine paperwork. But in reality, I was searching property records that lined up with the suspicious transfers. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Daniel had been siphoning money for years, using father's illness as cover. He had nearly bankrupted the company once already. The empire everyone toasted to was a facade built on sand. I confided in no one. Not my friends, not colleagues, not even the few family members who sometimes looked at me with sympathy. Sympathy couldn't protect me. Only proof could. Each night I worked late, my lamp casting sharp shadows across the walls, like I was interrogating the papers themselves. And with every new inconsistency I uncovered, I felt a shift inside me. The fear that had ruled me for so long was giving way to something else. Resolve. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to be seen. I was preparing for the moment they would have no choice but to look. I thought I was completely alone in this, until the knock came. It was late, almost midnight, when I opened my door to find Mr. Harris standing there. He had been my father's accountant for over 20 years, a quiet man with silver hair and a tired smile. In his hands, he held a worn leather briefcase. "I shouldn't be here," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder. "But I know what Daniel's been doing. Your father asked me to keep records, in case this day came." My breath caught. I stepped aside, and he placed the briefcase on my kitchen table. Inside were ledgers, receipts, emails, documents that matched, piece by piece, the folder I'd already uncovered. It was confirmation. Proof from someone who had lived inside the numbers. "Your father trusted you, Emma," Harris continued. "He knew Daniel would destroy everything if left unchecked. That's why he created the clause. He wanted you to have the tools to fight back." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I had spent my whole life doubting whether my father ever truly saw me, whether my devotion had mattered at all. And now, here was a man, carrying evidence that said, yes, he did. Harris looked at me then, his eyes steady. "But you must be careful. They'll come after you the moment they realize what you hold. The only way to win is to be ready before they strike." I nodded, my fingers brushing the pages like they were sacred. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving this family drama. I had an ally. And together, we were no longer just keeping secrets. We were preparing for war. 2 weeks later, Daniel hosted a grand dinner at the company's headquarters. Chandeliers glittered above polished tables, the kind of stage he always craved. He called it a celebration of continuity, but it was really just his coronation. Relatives, shareholders, old family friends, they all gathered, glasses raised, ready to anoint him as father's rightful heir. I sat at the far end of the table, a guest in the empire I had helped keep afloat. Daniel noticed me immediately, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, tapping his glass, "tonight we honor my father's legacy and the trust he placed in me to carry it forward. Not everyone was cut out for leadership. Some of us were meant to support quietly in the background." His eyes flicked toward me, and laughter rippled around the table. I clenched my hands under the linen, nails biting into my skin. Daniel wasn't finished. "You know, Emma's dedication has always been touching. She kept track of father's pill bottles, balanced the checkbook, even played chauffeur. Truly, she's the backbone of the family's errands. He raised his glass mockingly. To Emma, the most reliable assistant a brother could ever have. The room erupted in polite chuckles. Even Aunt Margaret dabbed her lips with her napkin, nodding as though it were all in good fun. I forced myself to stay seated, to keep my face calm while inside I burned. They saw me as nothing more than a servant in my own father's story, a footnote to Daniel's spotlight. But as their laughter swelled, I thought of the lockbox, the key, the folder, and Harris's briefcase heavy with truth. They believed I had nothing. In reality, I was holding a weapon none of them could see. So I raised my glass too, forcing a smile that made Daniel falter for just a second. To roles well played, I said softly. The toast carried a different weight for me. Because while they thought they were mocking me off stage, I knew the curtain was about to rise on a play none of them were prepared for. After that dinner, I promised myself I would never sit quietly through another performance staged at my expense. Daniel thought he'd written me out of the script. What he didn't realize was that I had the power to flip the entire play. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A week later, the company held its quarterly board meeting, the first since Father's death. I wasn't supposed to attend, but Harris slipped me a pass, his quiet way of saying, "You belong here too." The boardroom gleamed with polished wood and cold authority. Portraits of past CEOs lined the walls, each one a stern reminder of the legacy at stake. Daniel strutted in like he already belonged among them, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. When he saw me seated at the end of the table, his smile froze for a split second before he regained his swagger. "Emma," he said, voice dripping with false warmth. "So glad you could join. Taking notes for us, are you?" Laughter trickled around the table. I didn't answer. Not yet. The meeting unfolded with Daniel boasting about new opportunities and strategic investments. But the numbers on his slides didn't match the documents Harris and I had uncovered. My heart pounded as I waited for my cue. Finally, when the floor opened for questions, I stood. "I have one," I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled beneath the table. "Could you explain these?" I placed a folder on the table, sliding copies of the financial reports down the line toward each board member. Confusion flickered across their faces as they flipped through page after page. Withdrawals without approval, funds routed to shell companies, debts hidden under creative accounting. Daniel's smile faltered. "This is nonsense, he snapped. "Old paperwork. Out of context." But I didn't let him regain control. I held up the draft contract Father had left me. "It's not out of context. Our father anticipated this. He created a safeguard, a clause that if the heir engaged in financial misconduct, control of the company would transfer to a secondary beneficiary." The room went silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. I stepped forward, placing the brass key on the table. Its metallic ring echoed through the boardroom like a gavel. "My father left me this key. It opened his locked drawer. And inside was this file, his proof that Daniel was not fit to lead." Board members exchanged looks, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Daniel's face turned red. "This is absurd. She's jealous, fabricating lies to steal what's mine." But Harris rose from his seat at the back of the room. His voice was calm, but his words cut sharp. "I can verify every number. I kept these records myself, and I can swear under oath that Mr. Daniel Bennett authorized each of these transactions." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult I'd ever endured. The board members who once toasted Daniel now looked at him with suspicion, even disgust. For the first time, Daniel wasn't the star. He was exposed. I felt my knees weaken, but I didn't sit. I wanted them to see me standing tall, the daughter who had been invisible until now. This company was my father's life's work. I said quietly, and I won't let it collapse under lies. It wasn't the end of the battle, not yet, but the first shot had been fired, and the echo of it was still ringing in their ears. The boardroom silence that followed my revelation was only the first crack in Daniel's armor. I knew better than to believe it was enough. Families like mine don't surrender when the truth appears. They regroup, rewrite, and retaliate. That evening, I met Harris in his modest office, a stark contrast to the gleaming headquarters where Daniel had just been crowned heir. The desk between us was cluttered with files, receipts, contracts, our arsenal. "You've rattled him," Harris said, his voice steady but cautious. "But rattling isn't the same as winning. He'll come back swinging, probably with lawyers, maybe with smear campaigns. You need to be prepared for war, Emma." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. For years, my weapon had been silence. Now I was being asked to fight out loud, and the thought was terrifying. But then I remembered the laughter at Daniel's dinner, the way they toasted to my obedience, the way they erased me from the story even as I carried its weight. That fear began to harden into resolve. We mapped out our plan like generals before battle, organize the files, secure witness statements, trace every transfer Daniel had made. Harris contacted a forensic accountant. I reached out to a lawyer recommended by a colleague, someone known for dismantling corporate fraud brick by brick. When we finished, Harris leaned back and studied me. "Once we file this, there's no going back. They'll paint you as bitter, unstable, disloyal. Are you ready for that?" I met his gaze, surprised at the steadiness in my own voice. "I've been invisible my whole life, Harris. Being called names doesn't scare me. Being erased again does." The curtain was rising, and this time I wasn't walking off stage. The summons arrived faster than I expected. Daniel had filed an injunction, accusing me of fabricating evidence, of trying to sabotage the company out of jealousy. His lawyers crafted the story well. Emma, the bitter daughter, the spinster caretaker, who couldn't stand being overlooked. It was the same narrative my family had whispered about me for years, now weaponized in black ink on official paper. But this time, I wasn't alone. Harris, my lawyer, and the forensic accountant sat beside me at the long oak table of the hearing room. Across from us, Daniel lounged in his tailored suit, flanked by attorneys and Aunt Margaret, who stared at me as though her disapproval might crush me into dust. The chairperson of the board called the session to order. "We're here to resolve the dispute regarding the estate and the company's succession. Ms. Emma Bennett, you may proceed." My heart hammered, but I rose. For 33 years, I have been told I was invisible in this family. Tonight, I ask you to look directly at me. I placed Father's folder on the table, the brass key glinting under the fluorescent light. This is what my father left me. Not just a box, but the truth he didn't trust anyone else to hold. One by one, Harris and the accountant presented the documents. Misappropriated funds, fake invoices, transfers to shell accounts. Each page was projected on the screen for everyone to see. Gasps spread through the room as the evidence piled higher. Daniel's lawyer objected. "These are forgeries. Anyone could have typed these up." Harris stood. "Then let's hear from someone who watched it happen." He called the notary who had witnessed my father sign the original draft contract. The man testified calmly. "Mr. Charles Bennett specifically added a clause, naming Emma Bennett as secondary beneficiary should financial misconduct occur." The room shifted. Faces that had once sneered at me now turned uncertain toward Daniel. Finally, Daniel himself was called. He strode to the witness chair, arrogance dripping from every step. "My sister is delusional," he declared. "Father trusted me. She was just the help clinging to scraps of paperwork." I leaned forward. "Then explain these." I held up a series of emails Harris had recovered. Messages between Daniel and an outside investor, planning to sell off parts of the company for personal profit. The subject line of one read, "Once the old man is gone, we'll cash out." The silence was deafening. Daniel's face flushed crimson. Those, those were drafts, jokes. But no one laughed. The board chair's gavel struck. Enough! For the first time in my life, I felt the entire room's gaze fixed on me, not with dismissal, but with recognition. "This company was my father's masterpiece," I said quietly. "And if you let Daniel keep control, it will rot from the inside. I'm not asking for pity. I'm demanding respect. For the truth, for the work my father entrusted me with, and for the legacy he wanted preserved." The board members whispered among themselves. Aunt Margaret hissed under her breath, "Ungrateful girl!" But even she looked rattled. Then the chair spoke. "We will recess for deliberation, but let it be clear, this evidence cannot be ignored." Daniel glared at me as we rose from the table. "You think you've won? This isn't over." I met his eyes, steady. "No, Daniel, it's just beginning. But for once, it's beginning on my terms." As I stepped out of the hearing room, the weight I'd carried all my life seemed to lift, replaced by something I had never felt before in this family: power. When the board reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The laughter, the polite chatter that once filled those meetings, it was gone. The room felt like a theater after the audience realizes the comedy is actually a tragedy. Daniel swaggered back to his seat, but his confidence was fraying. His hands fidgeted, his eyes darted toward the exit more than once. He still believed charm could save him, the way it always had with father, with Aunt Margaret, with the rest of the family. But charm doesn't work when the script has already changed. The chairperson cleared his throat. "Before we deliberate further, there is one more set of exhibits." He nodded to Harris. Harris opened a second folder I hadn't even seen before. Outspilled emails, text message printouts, bank records, documents my father had apparently safeguarded with Harris years ago. Each one detailed Daniel's schemes: kickbacks from suppliers, backroom deals with investors, even a draft contract with a competitor to sell company secrets. Gasps filled the room. Aunt Margaret paled, her lipstick trembling at the corners. Daniel shot to his feet. "This is a setup. Emma forged the—" But the accountant stepped forward. "I traced every transaction. Each one ties directly to Daniel's personal accounts. The trail is undeniable." It was like watching a mass disintegrate. For years, Daniel had played the golden son, the heir, the one everyone admired. But under the bright fluorescent lights of that boardroom, he wasn't golden anymore. He was exposed. A fraud who had been draining the very legacy he claimed to protect. A board member leaned forward, voice cold. "Mr. Bennett, do you deny authorizing a transfer of company funds to an account in the Cayman Islands?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence was louder than any confession. I watched, strangely calm, as the image of my brother collapsed before my eyes. All the years of being mocked, minimized, erased, they had led to this moment. A spotlight he couldn't escape, a stage he couldn't control. For the first time, they all saw Daniel for who he really was. Not a leader, not an heir, just a man who believed lies could last forever. And in that instant, I knew the play had reached its turning point. The board chair's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. "This council has seen sufficient evidence. Daniel Bennett is hereby suspended from all leadership duties pending legal investigation. Effective immediately, interim control of the company will pass to the secondary beneficiary named in the succession documents, Emma Bennett." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. My name, spoken with authority, not pity, seemed to hang in the air like a bell that refused to fade. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "You can't do this. She's nothing. She was never meant to lead." But the board ignored him. Their eyes, once blind to me, were steady now, measuring, weighing, acknowledging. I stood slowly, my knees shaking but my voice firm. I didn't ask for this power, but I won't run from it either. My father's legacy will not be buried under fraud and lies. If you entrust this company to me, I will protect it because it's all I've ever done. Something shifted then. A man who'd barely looked at me before nodded slightly, respect in his eyes. Another cleared her throat and said, "We believe you, Ms. Bennett." In that moment, I felt the years of invisibility peeling away. I wasn't the assistant, the errand runner, the dutiful daughter who sacrificed in silence. I was the rightful heir, not because of blood, but because of truth. As I left the boardroom, reporters shouted questions. Flashes went off, cameras trying to capture the face of the surprise successor. For once, I didn't shy away. I met the cameras head on, shoulders squared, the brass key still warm in my pocket. Behind me, Daniel shouted, restrained by security. His words no longer mattered. His stage had crumbled. Mine was just being built. And as the cool air hit my face outside the courthouse, I realized this was not just a victory over my brother. It was a victory over every moment they tried to write me out of my own story. I had stepped out of the wings, and now the spotlight was mine. Defeat didn't hit Daniel all at once. It unraveled him piece by piece. The very next morning, headlines spread across business journals. Golden Heir suspended amid fraud allegations. His smiling face, once the symbol of our family's prestige, was plastered beside words like embezzlement and betrayal. The calls from investors stopped. The invitations to gala dinners vanished. Even his closest allies on the board quietly cut ties, unwilling to sync with him. At home, the fallout was even harsher. Relatives who once toasted his vision now whispered in corners, pretending they had always suspected something was wrong. Aunt Margaret, who had stood beside him like a stage prompter, avoided his calls entirely. And our father's old colleagues, men who once shook his hand with admiration, now turned their backs when he entered a room. Worse still, the authorities opened a formal investigation. The emails and transactions I'd revealed weren't just embarrassing. They were illegal. Subpoenas arrived. His accounts were frozen. The empire he'd gloated over was no longer his kingdom, but a cage closing around him. I saw him once in the lobby after a meeting, his suit wrinkled, his tie loose, his confidence drained. For the first time, Daniel looked small. When his eyes met mine, there was no smirk, only desperation. "Help me, Emma," he muttered, voice cracked. But I walked past him, not out of cruelty but clarity. He wasn't asking for help, he was asking for the same immunity he'd been handed his entire life. And this time, there would be no rescue, because the spotlight that once adored him now revealed the truth. Daniel was no heir, no leader, just a man paying the price for the lies he thought would never catch up to him. When the board officially named me CEO, I walked into Father's office for the first time not as the caretaker, not as the invisible daughter, but as the one in charge. The air felt different. The portraits of past leaders on the walls no longer intimidated me. They felt like witnesses, watching to see if I would crumble or rise. I started with the numbers. Together with Harris and the forensic accountant, we combed through every account, every debt Daniel had left behind. It was grueling, but it was also cleansing, like pulling weeds from a neglected garden. Each correction, each repaired ledger, felt like reclaiming more than a company. It felt like reclaiming myself. Then I turned outward. I met with employees who had been ignored under Daniel's reign. I listened to their concerns, their frustrations, their hopes. Many admitted they had been planning to leave, convinced the company's future was doomed. But when they saw me there, sleeves rolled up, not barking orders, but asking questions, something shifted. Slowly, trust began to return. Profits stabilized, not because of risky deals, but because of steady work, honesty, and accountability. I started a scholarship fund in Father's name. Not for family members, but for young interns and staff who showed promise but lacked resources. It was the kind of legacy I believed he would have wanted, even if he never found the courage to say it out loud. At home, I felt the changes too. The silence that once haunted my apartment now felt peaceful, not oppressive. I began filling the walls with photographs, not of family portraits where I stood on the edges, but of new memories. Colleagues smiling after a successful launch, Harris raising a glass in quiet celebration, even snapshots of myself at the lake house I'd rediscovered after Father's death. For the first time, I wasn't living in Daniel's shadow or Father's expectations. I was building something of my own, and every step reminded me the girl who once sat quietly in the wings had finally stepped into her role, not as the forgotten daughter, not as the background character, but as the author of the story itself. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start. Relatives who once laughed at me now wanted meetings, coffee, a chance to talk. A cousin who ignored me for years suddenly reached out on LinkedIn, congratulating me on my well-deserved success. Even Aunt Margaret left a message, her voice brittle with forced warmth. Family should stay close, Emma. We've all made mistakes. But I had learned too much to be flattered. Their sudden kindness wasn't about me. It was about proximity to power. For years, they applauded Daniel while I carried the weight in silence. Now that the spotlight had shifted, they wanted to rewrite themselves into my story. One evening, my father's oldest friend, Mr. Caldwell, visited my office. He looked weary, his hands clasped tightly. Emma, your father would be proud. We all underestimated you. I met his gaze steadily. You didn't underestimate me. You ignored me. There's a difference. The words hung heavy in the room. For once, no one rushed to contradict me. I wasn't cruel. I accepted some invitations, met a few relatives halfway. But I made it clear. Respect was the price of admission now. No more mockery disguised as humor, no more assumptions that I would clean up their messes. And as awkward silences stretched at family dinners, I realized something profound. It wasn't me who had changed. It was the balance of power. For the first time, they had to measure their words around me. The girl they once erased was now the one holding the pen. Looking back, I used to think my greatest loss was the will, that public moment when my father seemed to strip me of everything and hand it all to Daniel. But now I understand. The real loss would have been staying silent, accepting the role they wrote for me, and never discovering the power I already held. Family, I've learned, is not defined by who shares your blood, but by who respects your boundaries. Love without respect is just control dressed in Sunday clothes. And respect isn't given because you beg for it. It's claimed the moment you decide you're worth more than their version of your story. For years, I believed devotion was enough. That if I worked harder, sacrificed more, stayed smaller, one day they would notice me. But devotion without recognition is just servitude. And silence, when it protects lies, is nothing but a prison. The key my father left me wasn't just metal. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes truth is hidden away, waiting for the one person willing to unlock it. And once you hold that truth, you can't go back to the shadows. So if you're listening and you've ever been overlooked, minimized, or made to feel invisible in your own family, hear this. You are not defined by their blindness. You are not confined to the wings of their stage. You have the right to step forward, to claim your role, and to rewrite the ending. Because sometimes the bravest act of love is choosing yourself. Now, when I walk into the office, I no longer feel like a ghost drifting through someone else's story. The portraits on the wall don't intimidate me anymore. They remind me that even the strongest legacies can crack if no one dares to protect them. I keep the brass key on my desk, not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me of the night everything changed. A small, rusted object that carried the weight of truth, waiting for someone brave enough to turn it. Sometimes I still hear Daniel's voice in my head, mocking me, reminding me of all the years I spent in silence. But now that voice doesn't sting. It fuels me, because I know I stepped out of the shadows and into the light. And once you've tasted that freedom, you never go back. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been written out of your own family story? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew? Share your story in the comments. I read them all, and I know someone out there needs to hear yours. And if this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon, because the next story might just be the key you didn't know you were waiting for. The curtain has fallen on this chapter, but for me, and maybe for you, it's only the beginning.